We're live. Well, good evening, all of you out there. If there isn't all of you out there, it's been, what, Ian, like 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks since we last did one of these. So took a break for multiple reasons, but we're back. And this will be the last one before the new year. And it's a pretty special one, in my opinion. The gentleman I'll be speaking to tonight is pretty famous throughout our industry for many reasons, but largely as being just an incredible historian of California viticulture, a great winemaker. Obviously makes beautiful wines. His name is Tegan Passalacqua. His own brand is called Sandlands, and we're going to taste some Chenin Blanc from the Sandlands winery, and we're going to taste a Chenin Blanc from my family's winery, which is Lone Madrone. And then we're going to move in to our day jobs, and Tegan's day job is working winemaker, vineyard manager for Turley Winery. So he's driving all over the state, taking care of some of the greatest old vineyards that we have left in California, I believe. And we're going to taste a Turley wine along with the Tablas Creek En Gobelet. So we're pretty focused on some good dry farm business today. And for my part, I don't know Tegan really very well. I've met him maybe a couple of times, but I read a lot about him and hear a lot about him. So super interesting for me to get to actually have a conversation with him and see where it goes. As usual with this stuff, I think the interest is in learning a little bit about someone that maybe you guys haven't heard of or don't know. So exciting. And with that, I think we'll jump in and say hi to Tegan, if we can.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Tegan. Nice to see you. Thanks for doing this. Super exciting. So we'll delve into all of that. I mean, I hope I did a fairly decent job of describing who you are and what you've done. I mean, I know you've done stuff outside of the country too. My son, as I think we talked in the earlier discussion, is somewhat obsessed with even Saudi wines.
Yep.
And so I've been forced to spend lots of money on those in the past few years, and they are quite remarkable. And I ended up listening to one of his podcasts, a really interesting guy, and not so different in a lot of ways from what you're doing and what we're doing as far as valuing old vineyard and really guarding some tradition down there. So that's cool, and we can dig into him a little bit too. But mostly about you, and I mean, I think everyone knows Turley, I would assume. That's pretty big. I don't know how widely known Sandlands is. Certainly within my circle, everybody knows and respects it. So let's start there. I mean, we're going to start with your Chenin Blanc anyway and taste that. I'd like to taste the wine quickly, because what tends to happen is we'll start talking and forget to taste the wine. So let's get that going and start with. So explain a little bit, whatever you want to explain, Sandlands, the vineyards, the theory, the dream.
So Sandlands kind of came about by traveling the state for Turley and checking out a lot of old vine vineyards and always kind of wanting my own brand. And Turley's basically a Zinfandel only house with a lot of asterisks behind that. We make Cinsault and Sauvignon Blanc and a Rhone White and Petit Syrah, and we make a little Barbera and Cabernet. And so, but primarily Zinfandel. And so I kept finding, I'd meet people and knock on doors and say, hey, what's that old vineyard? And I really started finding vineyards that didn't fit the Turley mold, were not Zinfandel, that I was really interested in. So old vine Mataro vineyards, old vine Carignan, an older vine Syrah vineyard. And, I really just wanted to I love making Zinfandel, but I wanted to make something else. And, you see these old vines that really nothing, the Carignan that I got, the first year that I got it, I paid $500 a ton for it, and now it's going for $2,800 a ton, so it's a fair price, I think.
Put a time frame on that.
What's that?
Put a time frame on that price increase.
So it's 10 years ago.
10 years, yeah. So it's begun. Yeah. That's Amador. Is that where that is?
That's Contra Costa.
Contra Costa. Okay.
So yeah, and that's kind of where the brand started with those wines. And then in 2000, I actually made wine in 2009, and then 2007, I started buying some Zinfandel from an old vineyard in Amador planted in 1907. And in the corner, they had a little, acre and a half of head train dry farm Chenin Blanc. And I didn't really love the wine that was being made. It was picked at like 30 brick Chenin, and it was made kind of in a late harvest Chenin style, but fermented as dry as they could get it. And the year 2011, I went and worked with Evan Sadi, and I always thought the Chenin Blanc that I was tasting from who was making it in Amador, that's just what the site had to offer. And then going and seeing the Swartland and seeing the similarities with the Sierra foothills, and every South African I've brought out, like the Sierra foothills is kind of like, well, that's, what the Swartland's like. It's hot, dry, very neat soils. And so I came straight back and I'm like, I want to buy that Chenin. And they said, well, the people that got it last year paid $400 a ton. Will you pay more for that?
Yeah.
And I basically said, how about this? I'll prune it and I'll do all the handwork and I'll give you $1,500 a ton. And they said, are you sure? And so that kind of started in 2011. And the vineyard's planted in 1979, and it's head trained, dry farmed, and own rooted. I mean, looking at it, most people think it's, an old Zinfandel patch, but it's Chenin Blanc. And
Sure.
my favorite part about it was when I first got the fruit, the winemaker who had been making it, I was out sampling one day, and he's like, let me give you a piece of advice about that vineyard. He's like, you got to pick it over 27 sugar. You have to. He's like, under 27, it tastes all minerally.
No.
Yeah. And I kind of walked away and I go, wow, at 26.5, it still has like minerality. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It kind of could handle it. So we don't get much from it, in a big year, we'll get, 5 tons. And in a normal year, we probably get 3.5 tons from it.
What sort of rainfall is there in that zone?
It's, lately it's been in the 20s, low 20s. So kind of, just enough to get a crop. The bigger issue up there, it's at about 1,500 feet. The bigger issue up there is frost. They get frost late in the season. And so we have to prune the vineyard really late. The Zinfandel can be pruned earlier, but Chenin just seems a lot more susceptible to frost than, the Zinfandel.
There was I'm not even going to try to get into California viticultural history with you on the other end of this screen, but there was a lot of Chenin around in California for a while there, right? And
there was. And
they got poorly made and hence ripped out.
Yeah, Amador planted a lot. The general manager of Charles Krug Winery was a guy who grew up in Amador. And in the 1960s, he went back and got all of his buddies to plant. So, Charles Krug was making like 1 million cases of Chenin Blanc in the 60s and 70s. And it was all this head trained dry farm Chenin, from Napa, but a lot of it from Amador as well. So, and then kind of that went away. And, it's kind of like the story of, White Zin. Growers lost contracts. They replanted other varieties. And
sure. Chardonnay showed up.
Exactly.
Well, it's beautiful. And I totally get it. Certainly wasn't picked at 27. That's for sure. It's got great acidity and minerality for sure. Like you say, what are the soils? Did you say that?
So it's all volcanics and granite. So with a lot of quartz, my boys love picking out, baseball-sized pieces of quartz and bringing them home. And so it's red iron-rich volcanics, and it's sandy. It's on the back of what's called Sand Ridge up in the Shenandoah Valley,
which clearly is your kind of bent is to lean towards the Sandlands.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons for that is, I kind of feel like the actual creation of California with the uplift of the Sierras, kind of created an environment that in those parts of California you can grow on their own roots. Mm-hmm. Because of that decomposed granite washdown, you have a lot of sand squirts throughout the central and eastern part of California that allows phylloxera not to flourish. So that was kind of just thinking like, well, actually the creation of California is what created this environment, to be able to grow grapes this way.
Interesting, though. I mean, you're growing some grapes down here in the Paso area that are on their own roots, right? That were planted in the 1880s, and I've never spent any time within that vineyard, but I drive by it almost daily, and it looks like it's doing pretty well.
Yeah, the only thing I can think there is that the pH is too high for phylloxera to live.
The soil, you mean?
Those pHs get up to 8.9 at the top of the hill there.
Yeah, it's like Tablas Creek. We've got 8s at the tops of the hills, and I'm not super worried. And I've been doing more and more stuff with own rooting. Just I kind of like what it does, and I think it's an interesting way to go for us.
Yeah,
but we're not sandy, so it makes me a little nervous at least. So what about the winemaking side? What is the winemaking philosophies of Sandlands?
So it's basically, I like to say, I want to capture the California sunshine, and it doesn't need to be turned up to 11, but it's kind of like Turley. I mean, most of the picking decisions are made more on pH than anything. Sometimes you have to wait till the pH to get over 3.2 to pick, and sometimes you want to pick when the pH hits 3.5, even if the sugars are lower. But so the Chenin Blanc, I actually destem it and kind of crush it before I press it. Kind of traditional California white winemaking, and then it's fermented. No adjustments, and it's fermented in neutral French oak, and then it's aged in 500 liters and in 1,000-liter oval. And it's basically, I don't filter it, so it goes through mallow, and it usually takes about 11 months to finish malolactic without sulfur, and then it gets a sulfuring, and then once it's kind of settled, I try to rack it for clarity. I try to rack at least a month or two before bottling, but it does go through the vintage. So I do let it go through the next, bottle it in December, a year after harvest.
To go full cycle.
Yep.
Are you a native yeast guy, or are you inoculate?
On everything, yep.
On everything. Is that the same with Turley, or is
it is? Only we'll use Williams-Salem when we have to do a buildup on something.
Right.
But we don't inoculate any of the ferments, to begin.
Cool. What are your thoughts on this wine? You want to throw out some descriptive thoughts, what you like about it for the listening public or new to your product?
Yeah, I mean, I like that it's, if someone told me you could pick grapes at, 20.5 bricks and make a wine that I think is pretty full flavored, 12 years ago, I wouldn't have believed them. I feel like the more I work with the vineyard, I'm not afraid of picking earlier. I think Chenin puts on a lot of weight in the barrel, and it seems to put on weight in the bottle, and, it goes through malolactic, and I think that kind of helps it. I feel like the white wine philosophy is that I want a really phenolic juice to really protect it. That's why I destem and crush it. And then I feel like the barrel fermentation, if you remember when you're a kid, you had those little rock polishers, that looked like a little cement mixer, and you put rocks in and they'd come out polished. I kind of feel like that's what I'm trying to do, where you still have the density of the rock, but all the rough edges are smoothed off.
I mean, now we know why your kids are bringing home baseball rocks from Hey, Ian, there's a light switch over there. It might give better light. I think it's super cool, and I'm finding similar things in my own life of being able to pick things a little earlier than I would have done 10, 15 years ago, and really enjoying the end result, and being able to make wines like this that are 12% and have great character and body and acid and minerality. I think it's great. It's where it should be for me.
Yep. I've told the story a number of times, but it's one of my favorite wine making stories, is that in 2006, an ex-girlfriend worked at a winery, and they were making To Kalon Cabernet for a client, and they picked it at 23.2 bricks, which in 2006 was like no one picked at 23 bricks. And then another friend who was working for another consultant, they picked at 32 bricks, same backstop for To Kalon Cabernet. And I was kind of blown away by both spectrums, and I didn't think about it for a long time. And about 3 years later, I was in my dentist's office sitting there, and I opened up the Wine Spectator and they reviewed both of those wines, and the 23.2 brick wine got 95 points and the 32 brick wine got 99 points. And
Yeah.
I remember thinking to myself, with great vineyards, you have a 9 brick differential to make great wine. And it's the most important thing I think I learned. Like, you can determine style, but I mean, we all know winemakers who, if it were picked at like a half brick lower than they wanted, they would freak out and say the wine was ruined. And there were a lot of people when I've worked in labs and custom crush before that really reacted like that. And just, you realize that like great wine comes from great vineyards, and you can determine the style, and I think that should reflect the producer. But to think that if it's not picked exactly when you want it, that the wine's going to be bad is just, it really doesn't give the credit that I think vineyards are due.
I think there are a lot of people that like to think that there's only one point at which you pick it, and if you miss that, then you've made a horrible mistake, which I think stylistically, yes, maybe, but I agree with you. I mean, if the vineyard site and the grapes are stunning, then
the wine's
flexibility there. Yep. Would it be, at the risk of going it all in, would I be right to think that your ability and your decisions to pick a little less right perhaps has had an impact on the Turley wines too in the last decade?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that was kind of a slow trend, but I think, honestly, that story really influenced me quite a bit, and the Turley wines, because I realized that, when you go and walk a vineyard and everything's been done perfectly, you cultivated at the right time, you did shoot thinning, you did a light leafing, you untangled clusters that were clumped up. When you're walking through there and you just ask yourself, like, what are we waiting for? And I think Zinfandel specifically, and I think one of the problems with Zinfandel is it does start to oxidize on the vine. When you talk about freshness, even when you have good acidity, you can still have some oxidation. And I feel like the less oxidation we can get on the vine, the better the wine's going to be. Everything else is there. The extract's there, the intensity, the freshness, everything's there. It's really trying to kind of make wines that are, in theory, younger than they are.
I think, for people listening and for me to a degree, I would translate your terminology of oxidating on the vine to giving a Zinfandel somewhat of a pruny character in the bottle, right?
I think so, yeah.
Dried fruit sort of prune, which is not a desirable thing for me at all. But
yeah, and you can get that, you can get that at 20. Some vineyards give it to you at 26 bricks. Right. And some vineyards you pick at 27.5 and they don't have that at all. And I think more than anything, it's really working with the vineyard long enough. And I think, it's pretty neat. How long have you been with Tablas? Since the beginning, but how many years?
I moved onto the property in 1998. So I've been there in person that entire time, but I've been involved since the beginning. So first vintage was 94. So a long time, but since 98, I've been an integral part of the vineyard. So I think where you're going and it's a real treat for me. You're getting to use old vineyards, which is incredible. And I'm getting as many as I can before you and Turley get them all. But at Tablas, the joy for me has been to plant vineyards and watch them age and learn what to do with them as they age and as they get older, and get to know those different blocks, etc. And each year is different. And it's funny, you made a comment earlier of what are we waiting for? That's a question that is asked frequently in the cellar at work during harvest. I'll stand there with my team and we'll be looking at numbers and tasting the fruit and doing all the stuff we do when trying to make a decision. It's like, well, the sugar's only 21.5, and I'll say, well, what are we waiting for? What do you want out of this? Yeah, it's not going to have a lot of.
I said it for a while. I mean, you have the privilege of, that vineyard 22 years where I feel like it's, it's a loved one, where when you see them, you can kind of walk in home, I'm sure, and ask your wife, like, what's wrong? And you might not know what it is, but I feel
Right.
it's the thing you can do with the vineyard. There have been plenty of times when I go to sample a vineyard and I get out of the car or get out of the truck and, you get your sample bag off and you're starting to walk and you're like, we got to pick it.
Right.
And, people have been with me. It's like, well, aren't you going to sample? I said, yeah, I'm going to call the grower first and see when we can schedule a pick. We'll sample in a bit. But they're just visual cues that you can get if you walk a vineyard week after week after week. And again, the luxury, I think, is the knowledge that everything's been done that we can in the vineyard to grow the best fruit. And that's when I can ask the question, what are we waiting for? Because when you work with vineyards that maybe they didn't shoot thin it properly, or they shoot thinned it late, or they leafed it late, then you can kind of answer the question in your mind, what are we waiting for? You're like, well, it's a little uneven on this side, or this
Right.
is, but when you know that you've checked all the boxes, it gives you the freedom to ask the question, what are we waiting for?
Yeah, true enough. Well, let's move on to the Lone Madrone, Chenin. I'm intrigued to get your perception. So we'll pull up a picture of, it's actually not the Chenin part, but this vineyard was planted in 1970. That's it today. That's my son Jordan, wishing he was at Eben Sadi's, but he's not. Passalacqua. So it's dry farm, but it was originally on a trellis. Planted in 1969 or 1970. They're not exactly sure of the date, but there was quite a lot planted. Most of it was ripped out. This one section was left and completely neglected for a long, long time. I remember in my early days working in the industry here, nobody wanted anything to do with it. I first came in contact with it in the early 90s, made some at Library Cellars, and at that time we completely destroyed it with oak. But I always had kind of an affection of wanting to get it myself, and so I've been making it since 2010 at this point. Trying to change the farming slowly. That's never easy, but it is dry farmed, and it's crazy that it's even survived this long, and it produces some beautiful fruit. I think, do you have the old picture of Bailey? So that's a picture right there. It's not the Chenin, but it's the same vineyard. I think if you look, that the guy on the left is Barney Bailey.
Yep.
Who is the father of David Bailey, who still farms land right there. What you see behind, well, that's Jack Foote, who was the farm advisor at the time, who was still around actually when I came to town, but gone now. And behind them, I believe, would be what is now Adelaide Cellars. Up on the top, if you could see to the right and down, you'd probably see the old HMR vineyards.
And who did it historically go to when it was planted?
Who did it go to? I really don't know the answer to that. I think they were just planting grapes to make the land work, and I'm sure it went to north, probably. I'm not sure. I mean, they weren't wine folk. They bought the land, and they did a great job. I mean, that vineyard is now called the Old Bailey. There's Zin up there, and there's Cab up there. It was purchased much to the disdain of David Bailey. I don't know when, but Alex Trebek, the guy who just passed away from Jeopardy, he owned it and really did it no favors when he was there, tried to turn it into Pinot Noir. But this little bit of Chenin, which is down low, is way down below where these two are. In fact, we did a tasting in the Westie episode, and I had to get the Westie towed to the top of this hill to do it. Pretty steep and rugged.
I would think that's one of the earliest. I mean, if that's kind of a period photo, I mean, that's got to be an early, pretty cane-pruned vineyard for Paso Robles.
Yeah, well, that picture was taken in 1982, actually.
Okay, but still,
the Chenin had been in the ground for 12 years by that point. So, and
I don't know when the first kind of cordon or cane-pruned vineyards came to Paso Robles.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know that in the 60s, Dr. Hoffman was planting the Hoffman Mountain Ranch, which is now some of it's owned by Adelaide Cellars. They still make the HMR Pinot from that block, and the rest of it's now owned by Dow Vineyards, and it's probably all Cabernet, I assume. So that was early, and he was doing trellis stuff, cane prune stuff on his Pinot, and that was, I think, 67, somewhere in there.
Chelichev was consulting on that, right?
He was, yeah. And I mean, I look at that as being, yes, Gary Everly is regarded as a guy that made a big impact on Paso and chose Paso as a place with some form of knowledge. The guy that really saw what Paso Robles had, in my opinion, was Dr. Stanley Hoffman with Telechev, because he bought West Side, Limestone, Hillside, up on Peachy Canyon Road there. And there was, apart from all the dry farm, old school stuff. I mean, the Paderewski Ranch is around that neighborhood too, obviously. But he was the one in modern times, if you can call the 60s modern times, that decided that this was a special place to grow grapes.
Right.
I mean, he was one of those guys that was way ahead of his time and spent too much money, and the world wasn't quite ready for it, perhaps. But he saw it, you know, and he put a lot of time and effort into that vineyard, which I think is pretty cool. And some great, I mean, Paso isn't known for Pinot, but some really nice Pinot Noirs come off of that vineyard side for sure.
Right.
Albeit the Paso Robles version.
Yeah, I mean, Chelichev, you know, was also, he wasn't a huge Zinfandel fan, but he really rate Paso Robles Zinfandel. You know, that was one of the things that he
it
had.
would have been nice to have met him and walked around those fields with him at the time, you know, see what he had to say.
And I think he was just always looking, he just wanted to make Pinot Noir, you know what I mean? But he lived in the Napa Valley.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I think there's probably 3 people in town that would argue that it was the right choice to put Pinot Noir there, but I think the rest of us would have done something a little different. But whatever, he saw the soil. That was the thing to me. He saw the soil and the rainfall and the climate and realized that it was the right part of town to plant that vineyard. And I think that often gets overlooked, what impact he had, because it wasn't a raging successful brand, though it was good.
Right.
So we buy a little bit from this vineyard every year. We do a pet nat these days, which is Jordan's project for the most part. And we do a demi-sec and an amphora, which just a little bit, leave a little bit of sugar in there because I do like that.
Yep.
And but the bulk is this, which is Chenin Blanc, all direct pressed, all in neutral pungens. We're actually just buying a small wooden oval, about 13 hectoliter oval, which we're going to start using for this, which I'm pretty excited. That's always exciting to get a big vessel like that. Native yeast with all of my stuff and all of Tablas stuff, same story. Pretty special vineyard. David Bailey, who planted this with his mom and dad when he was a kid, owns still. I buy Zinfandel from him. He has head train dry farm Zin. He's a great farmer. Planted in 2000. Beautiful, beautiful fruit. He just took cuttings off of this vineyard and planted a couple of acres for dry farm head train, which is pretty exciting to see what that does.
And how big is this parcel of the Chenin?
It's probably 2.5 acres.
Okay.
Not a lot. And there's the family who now owns it makes a little bit, and Steve Gloucester in town makes a little bit. And I, you know, as you well know, I mean, whenever a guy like me is buying fruit from a vineyard like this, you're just hoping that someone that has a lot more money and a lot doesn't decide they want it. So I always look at it this way, Tegan. It's for me, it's like every year that I get to make wine from a vineyard that is old and has been there for that length of time, even 50 years, but if it's 80 or 100, even more so. I'll make it as often as I can, even if it's just one vintage that I get, just to have the privilege of working with a vineyard at that age.
And not specifically old, but one kind of goal I've set for Sandlands is to make a different wine every year. So not that I'm going to add to the kind of lineup every year, but there's one wine I want to make a different wine every year. And, because Turley's lost a lot of vineyards, even though Turley, we get in, we take over, we help with farming, we, convert it to organics, we compost, cover crop it. And then everyone else, is like, hey, look at that vineyard. That looks great. Wow, the wines are really good. And, then people offer, more money than, we can pay. The first rule, in my opinion, of sustainability is you do have to make a nickel. That's one thing a lot of people, I think, miss with sustainability. To be sustainable, you have to make a profit. You don't have to make a killing, but you have to make money and have a long-term plan that you can pay your growers, pay your workers, pay, all your suppliers. And, I don't think a lot of people take that same philosophy. They kind of always are robbing Peter to pay Paul, and which we all have to at sometimes. But I think the best way to keep a grower relationship is to pay your bills on time, always, and then to be out in the vineyard more than anyone else. So it's really hard for them to tell you, you can't get the fruit anymore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that case in point, though, right? I mean, if someone like Turley has got people taking vineyards from under him, imagine for a guy like me who doesn't have the resources that Turley does, for certain. And so you're always, when you have a great vineyard, the wines are getting more and more noticed. You're kind of always looking over your shoulder for that guy that's going to, but whatever, there's other things. David Bailey's planting a dry farm, head trained Chenin, that is going to make remarkable wine, and I'm pretty excited.
And what other on the west side, what other Chenin vineyards are there right now?
I don't know of one.
Didn't Justin?
There's one called Shell Creek, which is on the east side of town. And then Spanish Camp, I think, has some. But I mean, there was a lot of Chenin in the 70s and 80s, but they all turned to Chardonnay and Cabernet. Yep. And so this was just forgotten. It's like people forgot it was there, The game is changing in so many ways. I think you guys have the Uberoff vineyard, which when I was working with John Munch in Adelaide in the early 90s, they couldn't give that stuff away. I mean, they were bringing us samples, literally. They called it the Will Peat back then. And they were bringing us samples of the wine and trying to get us to take that vineyard. And just nobody was interested. I wish I'd had the foresight then to lease some of the old vineyards in town.
We have to pick it, up to 13 times for 16 acres, and that's like Brennan has done such a great job kind of blocking it out, how it ripens, where before when we've talked to how they picked it, they would just kind of start picking, and some stuff would be like 20 and some stuff would be 30, but you'd get like 25 in the tank. And they just kind of pick up, and now we like strategically scalp the hill, and then we go down to this section, and it's very strategic to make, and then we have these great parts that are picked at different times that we can then put a blend together. But I think it takes thoughtful people to spend the time, and Brennan Stover down there, I mean, he charges that hill more than like anyone, and his sampling is just great, and he's so thoughtful on the way it's broken apart that I can see how, but that's the difference between grape growing and wine growing. You know what I mean? They're growing wine by picking, well, it's only going to be 2 tons. It's like, well, let's go pick that, and maybe 3 days later we come back and pick 5 tons. But, especially with Zinfandel vineyards, people want to pick it. They're like, we're going to pick in 3 days. And it's like, well, how much are you going to pick? We're just going to pick till we're done. And I think, unfortunately, that's how a lot of Zinfandel has been treated, and especially down West Paso with, the different exposures and, elevation changes and even pH in the soil changes. You can't play that game.
No, and I can definitely vouch for that. Because I buy most of the Lone Madrone fruit comes from a vineyard that's not next door, but close to next door, and I pass Brennan often on the road when he's sampling and I'm sampling, or looking at the vineyard or whatever. I see him a lot, and I mean, we should give a shout out to him. He's got his own brand, Quench and Temper, which I've not been to his vineyard yet. I've seen lots of pictures and I've bought some of his wines, and it's pretty cool from what I can see.
Yeah, no, his vineyard's real. I mean, again, it's a work of art and passion. I mean, he planted tight spacing, everything's tied up to a single stake, 3x7 on and he's got very interesting soil there. It's Silex too. It's not typical, Paso Robles soil.
Yeah, it's interesting. Super cool. Well, What do you think of the Chenin?
I love it. And does this go through mallow, or do you block mallow?
It usually goes through. Yeah, I mean, we usually do things by taste, year by year, but I really like acidity, so this year it went through.
I mean, I think West Paso is, just a killer place for Chenin Blanc. I mean, everything you think about the way wines. I mean, I think Chenin, of all white grapes, it translates sunshine the best. Even in the Loire Valley, it translates like, the lack of it sometimes.
Right.
And that's what people love. But it's this translator of sunshine, and Paso's got sunshine, but also like the energy that you get from those, chalk-based soils. I think there should be a lot more. And I actually think, all over California, what taking hints from what they do in places like the Swartland, where, they might make a white blend that's based on something, but, this kind of, I'm a big offender too, but the mono variety labeling in Mediterranean climates, I think, is for the dogs. I think the best wines are made, from multiple varieties through a vineyard, and you kind of over time, which I think more than anyone in California, you guys have been able to figure out over time what grapes do well where, and then how can you use those in a resulting wine. And I think most people take the easy way out growing, varietally dominant varieties that you're like, well, there it is, that's it. And it's like, well, that is it. But what if, just growing Cabernet and Napa, and they're growing it to a place that takes out the dominant varietal character of the pyrazines. Like, no one wants pyrazines in Cabernet, but that's like its dominant varietal character. And I think, what you can do, and, what other Mediterranean climate makes mono variety wines?
Right. Totally. I mean, there's varieties that differ from that, but certainly, obviously, we agree with what we're doing at Tablas Creek, and largely what I do at Lone Madrone too. I mean, we do some single varietals for sure, but a lot of blending, and I think that's, I mean, particularly with a grape like Roussanne, being able to blend Grenache Blanc Picpoul is great. It makes a great wine. It brings things to the table that the Roussanne doesn't have by itself. Even though the Roussanne's dramatic, it gets a lift from those other varieties and gets minerality from those too, which we like.
No, I think half of a winemaker's job is internally having to deal with the contradictions that they like set up for themselves on a daily basis. You have philosophies, but this actually works better. And I mean, you look at Zinfandel historically, and Zinfandel, if you look when people sold it on the grape crates, a lot of people sold it as Zinfandels. It had an S at the end. And that was kind of this nod to a mixed planting, that it was mixed black, that it was the Zinfandels, it's like, and, I think that historically, like, we don't work with any old Zinfandel vineyards that are, 100% Zinfandel.
Right.
Like, we just don't have it. I mean, that came in kind of post World War II, when people actually started, buying from proper nurseries and laying out vineyards, and, the whole California viticulture changed with wires and, catch wires, 50s, 60s. But before that, Zinfandel was always mixed.
Well, we went away from that, but I think it seems we're evolving back into that with the way things are going, with a lot more people getting into certainly in my area down here, there's a lot of blending going on. When I started in the business in the 90s, it was Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandel, and that was about it. It was all singles, and no one was doing any blending, and that has changed dramatically now. I mean, basically all the big players in town, if you will, are blending to some level.
No, and I think that is something that sets Paso Robles apart as a region in, California, is that they have embraced that Mediterranean multi-variety wine, that it doesn't have to be Cabernet or Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or, Sauvignon Blanc, that it's Paso Robles red wine or Paso Robles white wine. And I think that, in my opinion, has really helped Paso Robles gain its identity. You know, it's kind of counterintuitive. It's like, well, what gives Paso its identity? And it's like, well, kind of the lack thereof mono varietal labeling gives its identity to Paso, in my opinion. And that kind of goes against what, you know, Santa Barbara's Pinot and Chardonnay, and, you know, Napa Cabernet and Chardonnay, and, you know, Sonoma's Pinot Noir, but Paso's just Paso.
Yeah, and that's been a push up the hill to get the American public to accept that as being okay, but we're there now to a large degree anyway. I mean,
I think you're crowning the hill. You know, I think you guys are up there where it's, you know, I don't think people, you know, clearly there might be an exception of people who go to Paso looking for a Paso Cabernet, but you know, that you know, you've got people going to Paso Robles to drink Paso Robles wine, and I think that is what every, you know, region should strive for.
that's a cool observation. Let's jump on to your Turley offering, which is the 2018 Napa Valley Petit Syrah Library Vineyard.
So this is a vineyard that you know, it's one of the vineyards I feel the most fortunate that I get to work with. It's in the heart of Napa Valley, in the heart of St. Helena. It's, you know, from what I know, it's the most diverse old vine vineyard left in Napa County. There's 23 mixed varieties interplanted in the vineyard, planted in the 1880s. It's head trained, dry farmed. Turley's farmed it for 22 years, and, you know, we've farmed it organically since day one, and it's just a real treat. You know, it's again, it's picking decisions on this vineyard to me are the most enjoyable of any vineyard we work with, because, you know, you have a bag that looks like, you know, Skittles, and, you know, it's all different grape varieties. It's all different colors of grapes, and you just kind of squeeze up the bag and, you know, taste the juice and say, does it taste good or not? But it's also a vineyard that you can walk in, and the predominant variety is Petit Syrah, and you can walk in and say, this vineyard's ready to go. Like, we need to pick it. And it's just a treat. You know, there's old vine, you know, 1880s Syrah, and, you know, the head trained Syrah really shows you, I'm sure you guys know why people stake it up in the Rhone, because you're walking through a Petit Syrah predominant block, and the Syrah just shoots are all laying on the ground. You know, they just have kind of collapsed. And then there's Aramon, which is the cross from AXR1, and those vines are just uber vigorous. And there's a lot of Carignan out there, Alicante Grand Noir, Cinsault planted in the 1880s, and a bunch of different whites. And even, I think I was telling you, there's the one Barbarossa grape that comes from Corsica. So I thought this wine would be fun, because I kind of feel like this vineyard is doing a lot, had done a lot, probably less scientifically than you guys are doing today. You know, this was kind of, clearly the owner of this was a grape junkie. You don't plant 23 varieties on accident. You know, he just kind of, you know, think about understanding how a site grows when you can walk out there and taste 23 varieties from one site. You know, in some years the white grapes are ripe, you know, they're really ripe. You know, when we have a low crop on the white grapes, they're ripe when we pick the red wine, but we pick it all together on the same day.
Seems pretty interesting too, though, for me. I mean, there's probably 5 grape varieties in that vineyard that your regular person would have heard of, right? A lot of no one's heard of. And from the little knowledge I have on the subject, when you were reeling off varieties earlier, they come from a diversity of places.
They do.
Where did this guy get them? And was he going on vacation and coming back from a different country with different?
There were a number of big importations, you know, into California, and I think people, you know, people had nurseries, and I think someone who planted vines like this had to, you know, have a curiosity to kind of get things from their neighbor. And, you know, one of my theories with a lot of old vineyards is that a lot of these mix also could have been replants, maybe in year 3 or 5 or 7 or 10. You know, we can't properly date a grapevine we could, if we have the technology. You can use the same technology they use to date a bristlecone pine with a boring drill, but the problem with the grapevine is the above ground isn't usually whole. When you look at old vines, some you can put your hand through the trunk, and but that's one of my theories. And you can see, like in places like Sonoma County, where the warmer regions have a lot of Carignan for acidity, and the cooler regions have a lot of Petit Syrah for color. And in the Zinfandel planting, so you can regionally go and see what they're like. It's kind of like, what does your like salt and pepper taste like? Like, it depends on like what you need.
Kind of feels a bit like too with a vineyard like this one, someone's thinking, I'm going to plant these things, and what's going? We know Petit Syrah is going to work maybe, but what's going to work here? Let's plant a bunch of different things and see what actually does well here, and take it from there.
Well, and one of the theories that a lot of people talk about is that a lot of mixed plantings that have a lot of white grapes is that a lot of times white grapes would have better yields in years that red grapes are down. So, when you're delivering to the co-op and they're just kind of taking everything, one of the theories is, that a lot of times, like, all varieties aren't down unless it's a drought. But, when you go through flowering, sometimes something's completely through flowering. Like, the white grapes are always through flowering at least a week or two before any of the red grapes.
And so all picked together same time,
fermented together. It's such a cool pick, going across.
Man.
We just do the conveyor sorting table at all the wineries, and it's just this white grapes, and guys are holding up, all the different varieties, and it's just a super fun, pick. It's just a really, neat wine to make.
How much do you produce of this?
So we usually get about 8 tons. So somewhere, 500 cases is probably like an average production of the wine. So
substantial.
Yeah, no, it's yeah.
And it's right in downtown, right? I mean, people have seen it.
A block and a half off Main Street. It surrounds the St. Helena Public Library.
Okay.
So someone asked the question, why is Petit Syrah the preferred blend with Zin? I think pretty much because it helps add color and tannin. Color, I would say, historically was the main reason that it would kind of make, when people are really concerned about color. I mean, Petit Syrah just really helps. I mean, and the thing is, I'm sure like 5% of Petit Syrah goes a long way.
Sure, and we make wine from that old oak vineyard that's right by Uberhof, and there's Jordan commented earlier, but there's Alicante planted throughout that vineyard in small quantities, but you want color, that brings color also. Red fresh grape, it's super cool. Yeah. Same thing on the sorting table, people are looking for it and like squeezing the red grape. It's kind of
it's the fun thing I always do when my boys are 4 and 7, when we're out sampling vineyards that have Alicante. I mean, it's the ultimate like viticulturist dad joke. Is I'm like, I sample, I'm like, I cut my hand, and they're like, oh, let me see, and
I'll try that next year.
My 7-year-old doesn't go for it anymore. He's like, no, you didn't. That's Alicante, and I'm like, so.
I'll try it on my 30-year-old next year. So it tastes great. I mean, it's got a lot of depth. It's got weight. I mean, you wouldn't perceive a lot of white grapes in here, I guess. It's complex. It's rich, and I love the structure of it.
Yeah, to me, like, I think when I taste it, I'm like, I truly believe like this is Napa Valley wine. Like all the things that kind of, that structure. You think of like Napa Cabernet and its structure and density and, what people love about Napa Valley wine. I feel like this kind of encapsulates. I feel like Sean Thackeray's Orion, which is just kind of due west of this vineyard, and it's a mixed planting as well. Most likely there's a lot of varieties he has out there that are in this vineyard, and it's not as old. But to me, that wine, the same thing, like knowing how he makes that wine. And I said it before, it's like, it seems like the most fancy flying enologist, like did everything to make this wine, but it's just a 90-year-old field blend in St. Helena.
It's great.
There's no tricks. There's no micro ox. There's no, it's under, a shed.
Any wood to speak of on this?
So all the Turley, Zinfandel, and Petit Syrahs get 20% new oak. And so this does too. And we're using about 15 different coopers. That's another thing that I really tried to do at Turley. A friend of mine who's a big kind of natural wine geek one time was tasting with me at Turley, like back in 09 or 10. And we tasted through a wine, and, you know, he's like, oh, yeah. He's like, you like a lot of Francois Frere on that wine. I'm like, no, I don't. You don't know what you're talking about. So, you know, I'm totally offended, you know. And so, of course, what do I do? Like Monday morning, I go back and I look up and I'm like, holy shit, like we actually put like an extra barrel Francois Frere on that wine, you know, and he picked it out. And I just, from that moment on, I'm like, I don't want anyone to ever be able to pick out a Cooper in any of our wines.
Yeah, Cooper. Is it all Turley, all French wood, or is there any American wood involved?
We use 20% Canton.
Okay.
So 20% new oak across the board, and then 20%. But so we use 14 French Coopers and 1 American. And kind of, people always ask like, how do you pick barrels? And I'm like, if I find a barrel that I like kind of add it to our repertoire, and then kind of see over the years how it plays. And, you know, if there's some barrels that I've been buying a lot less of over time, and then some that I buy a lot more of. Like Atelier is kind of gone for the last like 7 years. It went from a trial to, you know, we buy as much Atelier as anything. So, and I like what it does. You know, Zinfandel specifically, you know, a lot of people I think in California want oak to help enhance fruit. And I think Zinfandel is specifically a variety in California that it doesn't need a hamburger helper. Like it can do it, you know, it doesn't need something to help enhance the fruit. You know, I think getting a bit of structure, but the main reason at 20% new oak at Turley is I don't like old small barrels. So I kind of feel like 10-year-old 228s, they start to taste and smell like barrel, not wood. You know, they kind of become stale, in my opinion.
I find that strangely
large format.
I find that strangely more so with American oak than French oak.
Do you?
Yeah, I find that French oak just kind of gets neutral on more, but the American oak gets up funky. Like you're saying, it starts to taste just like an old barrel, and it doesn't add anything positive to it.
I just try to watch that. You know, we don't want to just buy new barrels to buy new barrels, but I feel like forcing us to buy 20% new oak just keeps us running through and keeps everything fresh. You know, and not, you know, I hate when I go and taste out of an old barrel and it's just like, that's not, you know, again, you get that like it's a stale barrel.
Yeah,
so trying to eliminate that more.
You know, it's one of the things I get to do almost none of it in my Tablas Creek world, because we're all 1,200 gallon foudre. So
right.
I don't get to play with many Coopers. We make a little Pinot, so I do some with that. And I just buy a couple here and there just to play with. But it's
so another Robles legend who thought Pinot was a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're past, not me. I'm enjoying trying, though. I'll tell you that. Well, let's jump on, because people are going to be getting sleepy. Try the En Gobelet. I think this wine is fantastic. It's really good fun, and as always, the knowledge of what goes into it and what it's about is really important.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not trying to, you know, I feel like you guys have hit a stride that few California wineries have. I really do. I feel like the last like 5 years that something for me, you know, I think we all have vision of what we want wines to become. And a lot of times it never, the way I see it as a consumer and a follower of your wines, it seems like this is probably what you guys wanted to do 22 years ago. And the reality is it probably takes that long to get there.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, both, I think with vineyard choices and age of vineyard is obviously important, but personally in the process of picking and making and creating the wines, we've learned and tried to figure out what it is because we started with the model of Chateau de Beauxtel, obviously, and that's kind of the inspiration, if you will. We're not trying to copy it, but
For sure.
inspired by a winery that's all about terroir and et cetera, et cetera. But then discovering what that means on our location, which in the west side of Paso, it's so diverse from one small region to, where the Uber off is to where we are is very different,
Right.
et cetera. So learning what that piece did and what wine is best made stylistically in our style, what works right there, and how do we achieve it? And I thank you for saying that. I like to believe it's true, but we always like to believe that we're getting better.
I 100%. I've felt that and I've always enjoyed the wines, but I just feel like the last, I don't know, maybe 5 vintages, they just seem to be, it's the wines seem more like confident or comfortable in their own like clothes or something. I don't know how to put it, but
it's interesting stuff, and I think some of that is the people that are involved in it have become more focused on what I've always had my thing, but the people around me that I work with have been with me for a long time, and everybody's kind of got on. Okay, here we are. It's falling into place.
It shows in the wines, and I think you guys are just doing an amazing job. I really do.
Thank you for that.
And it's pretty easy for people to go and buy To Kalon Cabernet and make a 98 or 100 point wine in Napa Valley. I mean, To Kalon's been grown for.
It's not that easy for me to do that.
That's to go out to Russian River Valley and make a 95 point, 16% alcohol Pinot Noir. To me, those are things that are easy. Farming is of a level, and people are paying such a high price for grapes that you just can be like, okay, pick it at 26 or 28, and that's already been done. I feel like what you guys are doing is something that hasn't been done, and I think it's neat that in like my 20 plus years in the wine industry, like someone's kind of accomplished that in the region, and I think that's very admirable, and I think it's a really neat thing to kind of, I feel lucky that I could kind of witness someone do that, because it's not like you guys just went and planted Paso Robles Cabernet on the, on the west side, and, we all know it's easy to pick at 27 bricks and 28 bricks and make great wine. That, as a winemaker, you realize that is something that anyone can do, and, and make great wine. I mean, let's be honest, but the kind of focus on making truly great wine, I think is, we all know that takes, there's a lot of work that goes into that I know that you guys have done behind the scenes that the consumer can't see, your colleagues can't see always, but it's showing in the bottle.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And that's compliment to Robert Haas and the Prans, and now Jason and the families that had the vision and stuck with the vision. And
well, for sure,
that's admirable. It would have been easy to jump ship and do the other style of winemaking you're speaking of, but they had a goal and a vision, and I've been on board with that since day one. And seeing it and seeing someone like yourself noticing and appreciating it is kind of a goal. That's a great compliment for us.
Yeah, no, I think the wines are stellar. So
this is En Gobelet. So En Gobelet represents a wine that we make solely from the dry farm head train sections of our vineyard. And they always wanted to dry farm when they planted Tablas Creek. They went ahead and planted on a trellis with irrigation and tight. For then it was really tight spacing. Now it's like 8x3, which isn't that tight anymore. But really the inspiration for me was I was starting to buy Zinfandel for the Lone Madrone project, specifically from David Bailey and David Osgood, who are two local farmers. And just looking at their vineyards and realizing that I was struggling with Grenache a little bit, and I wasn't pleased with what I was getting, and the the goal of Tablas Creek has always been to make wines that reflect that piece of property. And I'm looking at these old Zin vineyards, and then the Martinelli I knew of already, and the Uberoff, and I'm looking around and say, why are we not doing this? Why are we not growing Grenache in a head train fashion, true dry farming, traditional to, where are the great Grenaches of the world? Gigondas, Chateauneuf, the Australian bush vines, a lot of head train business. Why are we not doing that was my question. So I had my...
Sorry to interrupt, but in Napa, the amount of times I hear things like that at Napa, like, they're like, we can't do it. We can't do it. And I'm like, it's amazing how much people forget in 50 years.
Totally.
And 50 years ago, that's the only way things were done.
The guys I'm buying Zin from and said, why can't I do this? And they just looked at me and said, well, you can. You can grow anything you want this way. And so we did. We jumped in and we started planting head train stuff. And it kind of surprised me, the result. I thought that the result was going to be wines that were bigger, more robust, more powerful, and it didn't turn out that way. It turned out with wines that are more complex. They have an elegance to them, and the En Gobelet is different than the other wines we make. It's really, and it's taken a lot longer to get there too. As you know, you're trying to drive farm. We're 6 years out before we really see anything of any great value. So it's been a really interesting ride. Now, we haven't planted an irrigated trellis vineyard, with the exception of expansion blocks with the new clones we've been bringing in, for over a decade. We've been going all this direction because we're liking what we're seeing. It's fitting what the original dream was, I think.
The way I describe it, I mean, everything Turley's planted since the 2000 has been head train dry farmed. And the way I describe it, the wine, you can feel and taste the wines in 3D. Like trellis vineyards, in my opinion, are two-dimensional wines. And they're just, when you look at a head train vine and you see, when you talk about sunshine and the way the sun captures a head train vine, there's just so much more complexity that when, you go through Napa and you see these perfectly VSP, not a leaf out of place, and it's like there's sun here, and then, to me, it's also like a VSP. It's kind of like an on-off switch on a light. It's either on or off. Where I kind of feel like head trained is more like a dimmer switch. You know what I mean? And it's kind of the way it distributes sunlight to the vine is like a dimmer switch, where it's so much more intense when you have VSP. And again, I mean, what Mediterranean region, and Turley has, 50 acres of VSP. So I can, again, contradicting yourself, right, is a big part of wine growing and having ideas and goals and, trying to continue to strive and learn from farming and other ways of farming. But, the VSP is, in a Mediterranean climate, we're the only one that really thinks that it's a good idea.
Right.
You look at all the south of France and northern Spain and Australia. I mean, we know what that can do. We can grow grapes that way, and we can make really nice wines. But I think there is there's that extra dimension when you go, especially in Mediterranean climates, to head train vines. And I think this wine shows it.
Yeah, I'm super, super happy with the En Gobelet and the way it's evolved. I mean, it has hit its stride, certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, to be the wine that I imagined it would when we started planting this stuff.
And do you ever add anything other than the 5 that are in here? Or do you have any other head train blocks?
No, this is always consistently what goes in here. Not to say that wouldn't change. Do we have anything else? We do now. We just planted, and I'm very excited. We planted it. It's not a head train. It's a vertical cordon, but it's Sanso.
Yep.
Which I'm a big, Turley Sanso is probably the best value bottle of wine in town around here, in my opinion.
Yeah,
I love that wine. I really do. And the Sanso that we've got is Sanso that came through the quarantine process at Davis, direct from Boxtel, and yada yada. So we're just like first, second vintage in making it, and it's dramatic. And so I pulled out an ailing old vineyard that was planted super low, so frost is an issue. Hence the vertical cordon. I get a little more height off of it, but still will be dry farmed. So I'm pretty excited about that. But we're working on a project, a new hill that we're about to plant that will have Roussanne and Counoise and Grenache Blanc. And, as we move forward, we're going to plant a lot of head train stuff. So it's all going to be out there.
Very cool.
Which whites we haven't really done a lot with, and I'm disappointed. I think Grenache Blanc is going to be incredible. And for me, Grenache Blanc is a bit like you were saying about Chenin. For me, the Grenache Blanc is the greatest expression of our soil and our place. It's just like an image of what I smell and taste in the vineyard.
It smells like chalk, right? Like chalk sunshine.
Which is so cool, and that and a head train is going to be dramatic.
Right.
Well, we're over an hour, so I don't want to ruin your Friday night.
You can.
What was that?
Did you see the question pop up from Hal?
Remind us. What is En Gobelet? Is just the term for a head train vine, like a goblet, is what that means. So it's the terminology for head train.
What's in the wine?
What's in the wine? I'm gonna have to read it because I don't have that memory. But 36 Grenache, 28 Mourvedre, 27 Syrah, 6 Counoise, and 3 Tannat. And Tannat snuck in there because we have a lot of it head trained, and it doesn't go into any of the other Tablas Creek wines except for the 100% Tannat. And we had no Syrah head trained at that time when we first started putting it. And now it's just become part of the blend of it. And I like it in small components. There's been a couple of vintages that I think there was a bit too much because it's not a shy variety by any stretch. So just a hint of it's nice. And, we reserve the right to add other things if we choose to down the road. We're in the process, kind of in a closing thing, which you'll appreciate. I'm pretty excited. We're going to plant this very tiny parcel right by the winery, and we have all of the varieties of Chateauneuf de Pape, be it 13, 14, whatever you want to call it. We're going to do a little vineyard right in front of the winery that will be all 14, and it'll be like my mini library vineyard. I'll pick it all at once and make a wine from it, which is pretty exciting for us after 30 years to now have all of the varieties of Chateauneuf on the property. Is pretty cool.
And how big's that block?
Tiny. It's like less than an acre, but it's the beginning of something, and it's a great show and tell for people that come to visit. We'll do different styles of head train, vertical cordon, and show people what we're doing and why we're doing, and just use it as an educational spot, really. And for me personally, I'll be able to make a wine with all 13 in there. So that's a long dream that I've harbored.
Very cool.
Well, Tegan, thank you so much for doing this. I could easily go another hour with this with no problem at all. But people have a Friday night to go and enjoy. Not that we can go out, but whatever.
My 4-year-old just came out of. They're in the back bedroom. He just came out and waved to me. So
I know.
I know.
Next time we're down, let's go look at that Martinelli and maybe go to the Uber up, and we can go look at some stuff that I'm doing too. If you're up for it.
See it. Yep.
It would be a treat for me to.
Yep. I'll be down in the 18th of January. So
I'll put it on the calendar.
Okay.
Cheers. Have a great holidays.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Cheers.
you so much for doing